Mahito is back, Surugi might be dead, Maharaga's wheel is spinning faster than a boat rotor, Dabura has a domain expansion, and oh yeah, the merger might be happening. All that is to say, Chapter 21 of Majulo has officially leaked, and it is insane. And insane in the kind of way that Gege likes to make his chapters insane every once in a while. Now, is it insane good? Is it insanely written? Does it make me feel insane? Well, the answers to those questions all kind of depend on how many times you read this chapter. Because what we witnessed in Chapter 21 of Majulo was a masterclass in Gege's nuanced style of manga writing that unfortunately goes over the heads of the majority of the readers of this manga. Now, is that Gege's fault or the reader's fault? Who's really to say? Is it bad writing when the people who read the chapter have to read it a couple of times and Google everything that happened to remember the things that are being referenced in this chapter from years ago? Or is it good writing to tie in all of those incomplete storylines back into the story to give a fuller, more complete vision to this universe? Well, unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. But what I do have the answer to is what happened in this chapter, because that's my job, nitpicking every little thing that happens inside of a JJK chapter and explaining it to you so you can understand and appreciate this universe to your fullest capacity. And as this is the first truly confusing chapter of Majulo we've gotten, well, time for me to do my job. So with no further ado, let's head directly into Chapter 21 of Majulo Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. So, Chapter 21 does not pick up where Chapter 20 left off. Chapter 20 left off with Surugi releasing his connection to Rika and using the Binding Vow that he made to release Rika's power to increase his own speed and strength. This is actually something that we didn't talk about last week, because the rough translations that we were reading made it seem as though that Surugi was going through heavenly restriction in order to increase his speed and strength. Something that might have been imprinted into my brain on account of the fact that in that same week we got Maki versus the Zenin clan. And as Surugi is very much being painted in the Maki archetype, with him not only looking up to her when she was still alive, but also him literally pulling Dragon Bone out of his shadow to use in combat against Surugi, it seemed fairly certain in the moment that the reason that Surugi was able to get faster is because he made a binding vow to get rid of the rest of his cursed energy. However, the official translation and some additional details that we get from Chapter 21 make it rather clear that instead of getting rid of his cursed energy, Surugi actually just gets rid of his connection to Rika. Now, as to what degree Surugi severs his connection to Rika, we can't really say. However, we'll take some guesses later. Anyways, all that is to say that Chapter 20 ended with Surugi cutting off his connection to Rika and using the severing of his connection to that power to increase his own actual speed and strength to get the jump on Maru. However, Chapter 21 doesn't bring us immediately back into that moment, as Chapter 21 actually begins with a flashback. But it's not a flashback for Maru, as many of us may have anticipated on account of the fact that Surugi got the drop on Maru at the end of Chapter 20, which could have possibly led to his death, but rather, in actuality, the flashback that we're served to at the beginning of Chapter 21 is a flashback for Surugi. More specifically, Surugi talking to Maki. And in this flashback, Maki is telling Surugi that he's a lot like her, something that really excites Surugi because he wants to be just like Maki. And Maki continues on by saying, yes, one day losing something will be your strength. However, power like that is a double-edged sword, and thus you need to be careful because, well, yes, sometimes leaving things behind can give you power. In the pursuit of power, make sure you never throw away the things that truly matter to you. And it's at this point that Maki begins to wax poetic about her little sister, Mai. And while this might be a translation error, I really hope it isn't, because when Maki says, I had a little sister, Surugi goes, I know, Mai was my grandma, right? And while technically that wouldn't be accurate on account of the fact that Mai would be Surugi's great aunt, consider the fact that Maki and Mai were considered the same person through the eyes of Jujutsu on account of the fact that they were identical twins, I would really like for Surugi to refer to Mai as his grandma. Anyways, Maki continues on by saying, thanks to Mai, I became stronger. And once again, I'd like to hammer home the point that I genuinely do believe that the plot points of Majulo are trying to line up with the plot points currently happening in JJK's anime. Because what do you mean we're talking about Mai giving up her life for Maki and heavenly restriction immediately after all of this was shown in the anime like a week ago? But Maki apparently in her old age has become sentimental about Mai's death, as after acknowledging the fact that Mai's death is what made her strong, She wondered if she ever really did need to become all that strong. She wonders what would have happened if actually I died. What would have happened if Mai didn't die? Maybe somebody else would have taken Maki or Mai's place in the battle against Sukuna. And essentially what Maki is pondering here is what would have happened if she had listened to Mai. See, one of the biggest plot points surrounding Mai's death and Maki's ascendance is the fact that Mai didn't want to be a sorcerer. Mai just simply wanted to live with Maki. Mai had no problem living at the bottom, but Maki needed to prove to the Zenin clan and the world that she was powerful. However, in the pursuit of that goal, she lost Mai, something that she is apparently deeply regretful of. And while she acknowledges the fact that even thinking about this kind of thing isn't helpful or useful, and she even acknowledges her own accomplishments, because, well, yes, she's wondering if somebody else would have been able to do it, she is the one who did it. But none of that stops her from wondering what life would have been like if she had just simply left it all behind with Mai. Now, it's this point that we see the young Surugi step in and say, "Grandma," and in the next panel, we see, "Please don't cry." However, this panel isn't focused around Maki and Surugi, but rather Maru and Surugi. See, because in this panel, we see Maru looking down, tears streaming from his third eye as blood seemingly spurts from his chest. My light fell. But I say seemingly because on the next page, we see that the blood is not coming from Maru, but rather Surugi, as a deep slash appears across Surugi's chest, while his empty hand reaches out and Dragon Bone clatters to the ground. However, Surugi's momentum carries him into Maru's arm, who catches him, and with a stunned look on his face, simply asks Surugi, "Why?" He then immediately asks Surugi the question, "But if you had followed through with that sword slice, you would have won. Why did you spare me?" And in response, Surugi says, "I don't know, but something about winning that way, it just didn't sit right with me. I felt like a future where I won this way. A future where I secured the safety of humanity by cutting you down wasn't right." But Maru immediately gets defensive as he says, "But this wasn't about right or wrong. I thought you were fighting for Yuka." At which point the bleeding out Surugi tiredly says, "I don't know. I'm just 17. And as Surugi falls to the ground following the path of Dragon Bone, he sighs out, "I don't understand anything anymore. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." And this sends Maru into a panic as he reels by saying, No, that's not it. On Earth, in Japan, the people who have been here the longest, that's you, that's humanity, that's Surugi, that's Yuka. But cursed spirits are here too, but cursed spirits haven't been here as long as humanity because humanity was necessary to make the cursed spirits. But cursed spirits, they're a part of the ecosystem of Japan, and so what we're asking for is the Sumerians." But then, and he begins to trail off, and we begin to see at this point that Maru was crying from all three of his eyes, as he says, "Those who had their place taken from them, those who never had a place to begin with, what are we supposed to do? If those who were here from the very beginning were the ones in the right, then the earth, the universe, who does it belong to?" And as Maru curls himself into the fetal position, rocking himself back and forth, trying to soothe himself, he weakly says, "Surugi, I don't know. Yuka, Cross, anyone, help me." And it's this point that we see that an apparition of Rika appears in front of Maru. But it's not Rika, the queen of cursed spirits. It's Rika, the child. And she's smiling as she begins to fade away. Now, there's a lot to unpack with this sequence. See, obviously, the biggest talking point all throughout Majulo has surrounded the idea of Japanese isolationism and refugees, and the conflict that bringing refugees into a country can cause. In fact, the entirety of Majulo is about the refugee experience. It's about the fear of the refugees who have been displaced from the place that they called home, the people who have nowhere to be and nowhere to go back to. About how sometimes those who have been backed into a corner every single day of their life feel as though they need to back others into a corner to make them understand what they've been through. The Luma tribesmen warriors who want to use their version of cursed energy to suppress the power of Japan in a full-on frontal assault want to take Japan for themselves because they've had their land taken from them. While other members of the Luma tribe like Jabalama and Maru wanted to use diplomacy to try to integrate into Japan in the most peaceful and appreciated way possible. However, because of the fear of Japan and its isolationist nature, conflict arose even though both parties led with diplomacy. And this is because both parties, but especially Japan, tried to maintain their advantage from a bargaining perspective. And thus even the most diplomatic approach from Japan was still steeped in isolationist ideologies, still steeped in fear of the unknown. But what we're seeing right here in the end of the conflict between Surugi and Maru is the fact that might does not mean right. See, it is a Diskunte ideology to put forward two champions and have those two champions represent their respective parties. And after one of those two champions is crowned the victor, the party that champion represented is able to do basically whatever they would like to the other party. A system that forced the Loomer tribe off Sumeria. And yet, even though they were victim to that very system back on their home planet, here they were installing that very own system into the way that they were trying to approach diplomacy with Earth. But what Surugi is displaying right now is not only that youthful minds are often not calcified by the traumas of the past, and therefore sometimes the minds most primed to breaking these powerful and awful cycles, but also what Surugi is doing by dropping his blade, even though he could have won the fight, showing Maru that might isn't going to make right today. And the reason this sends Maru into such a spiral is the conflict in Maru's mind over realizing exactly what Surugi did. See, because if humanity doesn't have the right to be correct because they were there first, but also doesn't have the right to be correct because they are stronger, then who holds the power? If might doesn't make right and originality doesn't give you the ability to push around those who are trying to come to the place that you're currently occupying, then who's in the right? And the answer to Maru's question lies in the final question that he asks. If those who were here from the very beginning are those who are in the right, then the Earth, the universe, who does it all belong to? And the answer is nobody. See, country lines are made up by men who are long dead, men who wanted to own a piece of the thing that we all share. Earth, the universe, the sun, all of it. A refugee is only a refugee because people still hold on to this idea that we own little parts of a thing we all share. Being somewhere before somebody else doesn't mean you own the thing. And only humanity, with their compulsive need to own a slice of the pie that's big enough for all of us, has this idea in their head. But in a way, Surugi dropping his blade and allowing for Maru to win was a way for Surugi to show Maru that he wouldn't buy into this idea that Maru should be pushed away. See, well, yes, initially Surugi was fighting for Yuka. Surugi eventually came to the conclusion that killing his friend to save his sister may just not be worth it. And he also realized that he had very little right to tell Maru that him and his people shouldn't be here in Japan. And thus Surugi opened the door to coexistence. Now, as for what's going on with Rika, that's not necessarily tied to the talking points and more just tied to what Surugi did. See, like we talked about earlier when we did our chapter 20 breakdown, I believe that what we were seeing was a heavenly restriction, that is to say, the throwing away of cursed energy from Surugi to increase his speed and strength to become much more like his grandmother. And while there is still a possibility that that played into a little bit of effect here, what's seemingly being displayed is that Surugi threw away his connection to Rika and maybe possibly Yuta's ring's connection to Rika in order to increase his own speed and strength. And this kind of makes sense. That's how a binding vow with oneself could work. Surugi, who now has the ability to tap into the almost limitless cursed energy of Rika, made a binding vow that he would never use Rika's cursed energy again and seemingly would allow Rika to return to heaven, or maybe even go to heaven in the first place, in exchange for increased speed and strength, and therefore, in essence, a kind of heavenly restriction. A heavenly restriction that may not require Surugi to get rid of what little cursed energy he actually has. Because throwing away a connection to Rika is a pretty crazy sacrifice. A pretty crazy sacrifice that would get you the kind of speed and strength that you would need to get the drop on Surugi. And thus the imagery of the little girl Rika fading away and not the Queen of Spirits makes me believe that now Rika's time on Earth is over. That she's been given a happy ending to her story. See, because even though after Yuta and Maki were dead and gone, seemingly Rika as a vengeful cursed spirit still was tied to Yuta's ring and therefore tied to the earthly plane. And while Yuta from heaven was able to reach out to her and tell her to help his grandson, it seems as though now Surugi has released her from her binding, essentially exercising her as a cursed spirit. See, vengeful cursed spirits are a type of cursed spirits that are made from a human soul that is cursed at the moment of its death. And thus, because Yuta couldn't accept Rika's death, he turned her into a vengeful cursed spirit, binding her soul to his ring. And while these cursed spirits can be exercised in all the standard kind of ways, it's seemingly now being shown that if the curse is effectively undone on the human soul that was turned into a vengeful cursed spirit, that they can be exercised in a non-violent fashion. And thus Rika's soul finally gets to rest. Now, after we see Rika's soul most likely heading up to heaven to fight against Maki, we cut over kind of to the battle between Dabura and Maruga. Now, I say kind of because in actuality, we cut to some images of Nanao, that is to say the Cimmerian mothership, and some very special cargo that apparently the Cimmerians packed with them on their mothership. See, because at the top of the mothership, there's a half dome, and apparently in that half dome sleeping, surrounded by floating Maru, that is to say the special rock that comes from Cimmeria that amplifies cursed energy usage, is a Kalyan, but not just any Kalyan, specifically the eldest Kalyan that the Lumer tribe hails as their one true god, the Kalyan that tells young Lumerians as to whether or not they are going to enter into the warrior class after their birth. And it's after we see this Kalyan that we then flash over to Dabura, who's having another breakthrough, as he says to himself, Maru, indeed. So to use this technique, I need to create a barrier. Now, for those of you who don't remember, in the last chapter, Dober started messing around with curse technique reversal. After he figured out how to times curse energy by itself to make positive energy and heal himself, he also began to apply that level of thinking to his own curse technique. And as his own curse technique was light and killing intent, he began to make some kind of dark orb. A dark orb that I guessed most likely would control gravity in some kind of way, as the reverse of light is either darkness or like a black hole, depending on if you're talking about the source of light or just the light itself. But seemingly, the gravity guess was correct, because once Dabura is done making this essentially black hole, everything around him begins to float into the air. The buildings that have been slashed during his battle against Maruga begin to float and begin to build into a shape. And even the Lumerian mothership begins to be pulled down towards Dabura, as he asks Maruga, hey, does this technique exist on Earth too? But as Dabura begins to build a barrier with destroyed buildings and the Cimmerian mothership, Maruga's wheel begins spinning like a boat rotor, faster than we've ever seen it spinning before. And this unnerves Dabura as he begins thinking to himself, what is it adapting to? Is it adapting to my cursed energy, or is it adapting to my existence overall? But obviously, on account of the fact that Maruga does not talk, Dabura can't ask it this question. Something that Dabura chuckles about as he brings his two hands together and says, this is the first time I've ever wanted to exchange words with someone quieter than me. And it's this moment that we get the reveal of the latest and probably last domain expansion in the JJK universe. Domain expansion, and I'm gonna have to read this part, Another World of the Unseen and the Manifest Reverse Crossing. Now, that title's obviously subject to change with the official translation, and probably will, but for the moment, that's what we got. Now, rather interestingly, what we see that Dabura has done is slightly akin to what we see Megami do during the Culling games when he's fighting against Reggie Star. See, because rather than trying to figure out exactly how barrier techniques work, Dabura instead enclosed both him and Maruga in a globe of buildings he controlled with his gravity technique, and then opened his domain expansion within the confines of that globe of building. Sphere. Sphere is the better word. But has Maruga already adapted this domain expansion, and what will it do? Will this be the killing blow to Maruga once and for all, or will it just be another thing that it'll be able to adapt to? Well, unfortunately, those aren't questions we can answer today, because immediately after the reveal of this brand new domain expansion, we cut to Yuji, who's rather interestingly standing alongside Maru looking at the Kalyan that was just shown atop the Cimmerian mothership. So did Yuji somehow grab Maru and fly him off to the top of the Cimmerian mothership to check in with the oldest Kalyan the Lumer tribe has? Well, no. See, because obviously the last we saw Maru, he was in the fetal position alongside a bleeding out Surugi, begging for anybody to help him. And last we saw Yuji, he was literally cutting cities in half, killing thousands of cursed spirits in one dismantle. And thus the two of them were nowhere near each other. On top of this, when we saw the Kalyan, they were in a completely different place than they are right now. Moreover, for some reason, both the ceiling and the floor are the same texture, and that texture is weird, or like loosely Fendi's logo. So it seems as though Maru, Yuji, and the Kalyan have all been teleported to some kind of subspace, and all three of them are strangely cool with it, as immediately Yuji goes, whoa! Is that a Kalyan? And before he gives Maru the chance to answer, he says, just so you know, I've got the general outline of everything that's been going on from Todo. So apparently Todo is still alive, which is impressive considering the fact that he's canonically 2 years older than Yuji. But apparently not only is Todo still alive, he's still involved in everyday jujutsu politics. So much so that he's keeping Yuji in the know. We then immediately learn another thing about Todo, which is that apparently he's still got his, what was it called, like a vibram or a vibrato, or it was his stupid slap instrument hand. As Maru says, Todo, was that the funny guy with the instrument on his hand instead of a, hand? Then again, with how well that thing worked in the battle against Sukuna, I guess I'd probably keep it as well. Anyways, after this, Maru begins to explain to Yuji that yes, this is a Kalyan, but more specifically, it's the longest lived Kalyan that is revered by all of the Lunar tribesmen on this mothership. And as Yuji pets it, he says, it really does resemble a cursed spirit. So then, why was I brought here? To which Maru immediately responds to by saying, my technique deemed you suitable. To which Yuji asks, suitable for what? At which point Maru begins to explain something that's confusing a lot of fans, so let's try and go over it in the most amount of details that we possibly can. See, Maru goes on to say that the cursed energy that was inside of Yuka and Surugi's grandfather's ring, the Maru that comprises the mothership that we rode here on, by combining all of that with both mine and Cross's technique, and I'm assuming Cross here because the translation says his, I want to begin harmony between Cimmerians and Earthlings. However, I cannot proceed on my own authority. Itadori Yuji, I want you to pass judgment on this ceremony and to serve as witness as the representative of Earth. Now, Yuji, intrigued by this premise, says, harmony, huh? What exactly do you mean by that? See, because Yuji's been pitched harmony before, specifically harmony between all the people in Japan with Kenjaku's merger. But rather than trying to find a way to evolve cursed energy and to send the hive mind of Japan into madness as it encroaches on the entirety of Earth, the harmony that Maru is looking for, while being drawn exactly like Gojo's Nah, I'd Win panel for some reason, is to create a world where cursed spirits are no longer born. And that catches Yuji off guard for a second. See, because creating a world where cursed spirits are no longer born has been a noble goal of people that Yuji has looked up to for a long time. It was the goal of Yuki and Geto, and therefore by extension, people like Gojo. However, nobody had ever been able to find a way to pull it off. Geto wanted to turn the entirety of Japan's population into sorcerers, either by awakening them or culling the non-sorcerers. Yuki explored ways of trying to apply heavenly restriction to the entirety of Japan's population, and yet try as they did, nobody was ever able to find a way to eliminate cursed energy. And yet here in front of Yuji, after an arduous, almost 70-year fight against the cursed spirits of Japan, a title and curse shackled to him longer than any other cursed spirit user in the history of Japan, finally, he was looking at someone who may have the ability to make it all go away. See, this moment and Cross's plan gives some additional context to what was going on with Rika. See, seemingly in Rika's final moments, she gave up the entirety of her cursed energy over to Maru as he was crying out into the ether for somebody to come help him to bring together the Kalyan, Yuji, and Maru. And with the overflowing amount of Rika's cursed energy, some of the highest we've ever seen in the JJK universe, combined with the massive amount of ultra high quality Maru that makes up the Cimmerians' mothership, somebody has finally been afforded a way to eliminate cursed spirits forever. And it's at this moment that Yuji does something that's really cool. See, because Yuji, in response to hearing Maru's noble goal, reaches into his jacket and pulls out a book. A book, he says, belonged to his older brother. A book that held on to the unfulfilled wish of somebody who once took care of him. That somebody being Yuki. See, Yuki Tsukumo is not only the woman who got Todo into tall women with big butts, but also the woman who accidentally sent Geto down the path of eradicating all non-sorcerers from Japan. See, Yuki, even though she was a special grade sorcerer, wasn't involved with Jujutsu High because A, she disagreed with the Jujutsu higher-ups, kind of like Gojo, and B, because she wanted to dedicate her entire life to the eradication of cursed energy. And therefore she kept notes about all of the findings that she found about the separation of the body from the spirit, that is to say, the cursed energy, in a notebook that she entrusted to Chozo during the perfect preparation arc. A notebook that Chozo then entrusted to Yuji before his death in the battle against Sukuna. And thus the will of Yuki was passed to a death womb painting, who desperately wanted to understand what he was and why he was made. It was then passed from a death womb painting to his little brother, another death womb painting, in a perfect perfect vessel for Sukuna, who needed to better understand how to separate the spirit from the body in order to create a dismantle that could target Sukuna inside of Megami's vessel. And now, not only the unfulfilled wish of Yuki, but also a better understanding of the separation between the spirit and the body is being passed to Maru, who is going to once and for all try to separate people from their cursed energy. Yuji then, after throwing Maru this book, says, let's do it, and Maru seemingly uploads it to the cloud or something. Before they get to initiating the best kind of merger, Maru says, there's one more person we need for this harmonization. He, like you, is crucial to the pulling off of this technique. So first, let's go meet him. And as Maru pulls back one of the walls in a curtain-like fashion, he says, it seems this place is a crossroad for every soul that's ever inhabited Earth, and he appears to be one of its inhabitants. And as Yuji walks through this curtain into a seemingly dark room, he laughs to himself as he says, what a familiar face. And it's at this point that we see Mahito, who's currently doing his best kite impersonation, deliver his favorite 2 words. Itadori Yuji. And Mahito begins to excitingly ramble about how Yuji is late and how he's been waiting for him for all these years. And he yammers on until eventually he asks Yuji, how did you die? But as he asks the question, he realizes something's wrong. And that something is that Yuji isn't actually dead yet. And in response to his observation, Yuji simply says, I was just called here. And this forces Mahito to fall back as he relives Yuji hunting him down as a wolf 70 years ago, as he begins to panic, screaming about how he's been waiting this whole time. But as Mahito tries to reel away from Yuji and Maru, they flank him on both sides, as Maru says, let's begin. The narrator's final note being, the goal is the harmony of the world. Now, this is all very interesting, but what's happening is fairly obvious. With the 3 people that are in this room, we are being shown 3 very distinct curse techniques. I'm now just realizing that when Maru said earlier, we also need his technique. He was talking about Mahito, not Cross. But what we have in Yuji is a person whose dismantle is able to target the boundary between the soul and the body. Maru, a person who's able to control entropic forces and make things that seem irrational happen. And Mahito, who has idle transfiguration. And that's essentially what I believe the end goal of these 3 is going to be, is that they are going to use all of the Maru of the mothership, the overflowing cursed energy of Rika, and Maru, Yuji, and Mahito's cursed techniques to separate Japanese people from their cursed energy, causing for no more cursed energy leakage, and therefore no more cursed spirit births. Now, this doesn't mean that all cursed spirits will be eradicated. No, because the cursed spirits are believed to be Kalyans by the Sumerian people. However, so long as those cursed spirits are tended to by the Sumerians and aren't hunted down by humanity because additional ones aren't being made, an inroad for harmony is built between humanity and the aliens. Now, as to how these 3 techniques are going to blend together perfectly to separate humanity from their cursed energy, well, I mean, it seems fairly obvious, right? Either a nationwide or globe-wide attack, kind of like what happened at the beginning of the Culling Games, is launched that separates humanity from their cursed energy using Yuji Dismantle, changes the anatomy of humans' bodies to no longer make cursed energy using idle transfiguration, and makes a relatively nonsensical thing of either humanity no longer having negative emotions or no longer having those negative emotions tied to cursed energy happen with Maru's curse technique. And therefore, essentially, Yuki's dream team has been assembled. And yes, dream works 2 ways there. It was her dream team to complete that dream. You get it. And thus, it seems as though, once again, Gege is going to be using Majulo as a way to tie up loose ends from JJK. And that now, 70 years later, we are truly going to get an end to JJK that so many of us wanted. An end that frees Yuji from an endless struggle of defeating cursed spirits for the entirety of Japan. An end that Geto, Nanami, and Gojo would have wanted as teenagers. An end that would have saved the life of their friends like Haibara. An end that people like Yuki were actively pursuing. And the irony of all of it, and possibly the most beautiful bit of writing that Gege has ever done, is that in order to accomplish the intrinsically human issue of cursed energy, it took not only accepting aliens into Japanese society, but also leaning on those aliens' help to fix problems in Japan they could not fix on their own. If you don't understand that Gege is beating you over the head with the idea that Japanese isolationist policy is a bad idea. You have the reading comprehension of what everybody says JJK fans have the reading comprehension of. That is to say, a rock at the bottom of a very deep lake. This is genuine masterclass writing. And while it might have seemed a little bit confusing at first, I hope after today's video, it makes more sense to you. And if it does, let me know what you loved about this chapter and what you've loved about Majulo in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go ski a spring skiing day in early February. We're destroying the earth.